Well, hey, everybody, let's go ahead and keep the conversation going as we talk a little bit about expenses in higher education. Now, last week we talked about revenues and how the diversity of revenues and the way we engage with revenues is so critical. But as we start talking about expenses, I think it's important for us to remember that there are a few things this week that are really critical to understanding expenses in higher ed. First, not all expenses are the same. When we get revenues, oftentimes there is money that's for specific purposes. We call this restricted versus unrestricted funds. So think for a moment about how, there might be money we get from the state that has to be spent on students. There might be money we get from a donor that has to be spent on a specific program or project. There's restrictions to money. And so our expenses kind of is where that comes to fruition. There's a lot of different sources of expenses. There's, kind of operations and maintenance of buildings. There's scholarships. There's, kind of the faculty salaries and things of that nature. And so those are really critical things to remember. And then the other thing is the last three here all talk about how expensive people are. So people are the biggest expense in higher ed. Investing in people is expensive. Even if you give everyone a 1% pay increase, for example, that can be millions of dollars if you have a large budget. And so thinking about it from that perspective is so critical. But also replacing people can be a big expense. So when we're trying to hire someone new, this can be a big expense for us. So in the chapter, we talk a lot about how salaries and benefits, 70 to 80% of the budget, right? So right off the top, people are taking the vast majority of our budget, and that's where our expenses are. There's also program-specific supplies, there's office supplies, there's computer equipment and software, which is becoming increasingly critical when we talk about the expenses. We also have communications can be expensive, publications and printing, postage, programming, professional development funds, travel, entertainment and gifts, facilities, scholarships and fellowships. Not to mention, there's a host of other expenses that we have to think about when we talk about expenses in higher ed. This week, we also talked a little bit, or you had a chance to dig into a report on procurement, right? Which is how institutions go about purchasing things. In that report, there was a survey, and three-fourths of respondents said their processes were overseen by a state entity, right? So if you're a public institution, chances are you have somebody that's overseeing your expenses, particularly your procurement process. So oftentimes when there's a big expense, this is when we have to, go through the state mandated bid process. But there's a lot of different ways that institutions engage in procurement. This week, we also had a chance to read this Paulson and Smart article. We talked about trends in revenues and expenses in public higher education. Some of the big cost drivers. First, students' responsibility to pay is increasing the cost. The price of goods and services, even when, kind of there's a big expectation out there that we should decrease tuition and fees, the cost of higher ed continues to go up, both in terms of the people, but also the systems and the structures that are used. Reinvesting in the institution is a big expense, and it's something that we have to do. And then we've already talked a little bit over the last couple of weeks about tuition discounting. So oftentimes institutions, in order to recruit students, will kind of add scholarships onto their tuition, which reduces revenue, right? And this can be challenging. So again, as we talk about expenses, I think the biggest thing that we need to remember is that when we engage in expenses, there's a lot of different ones, but oftentimes we also have to think about how not all expenses are the same. Right? The idea of restricted and unrestricted funds, the idea that some expenses are so much that we have to go through a bid process and have that experience. That's really at the heart of expenses in higher ed, is that it's complex and that there's a lot of ways to think about it.